My professor is threatening to fail me on purpose in an effort to get me to sleep with him. This all started in the middle of the semester, when my professor asked me to stay after class to go over my midterm. My professor is an older man, probably mid-40s, and he is not ugly by any means, but he's mentioned his wife and kids multiple times at the beginning of the semester and I'm extremely grossed out. I, 20F, am a junior in college, and have a 3.9 GPA, so getting a good grade is detrimental to me, and the class that I have with this professor is one of my capstone classes. So that day, he handed me back my midterm, and on the top of the paper, it said grade pending. I looked at the grades others around me have received and they all had a regular number grade on their exams, so this came off as weird to me. I stayed after class and he told me that I'm a very bright young girl, and he sees a lot of potential in me, but he has a few things to go over with me that he believes would help me prosper in the long term. I legit had no idea what he meant by that, so I just stood there a little confused waiting on what he would say next, and so he asked me if I would be willing to get coffee with him. I was a little confused, but I figured there was no harm in networking with a successful elder, so I agreed to meet him for coffee the next day at 12 p.m. He said that he didn't want to inconvenience me in any way, so he would pick me up and drive us there. At 11:45 a.m., I was ready and waiting on the block of my dorm when he showed up looking extremely put together. His hair had gel in it, he had a button-up shirt on, and when I got in his car, I noticed he didn't have his wedding ring on. I already had a weird gut feeling, and when we pulled up to the cafe he mentioned, he ended up leading the way inside right next door, which was a Michelin star restaurant that is very expensive in the neighborhood. Most college kids don't go there as their prices are beyond reasonable. As my professor was following the hostess to the seats that he had apparently reserved, I asked him what happened to going to the cafe as we had discussed, and he said he figured I'd be hungry around lunchtime and wanted to treat his star student to something special. This made me feel extremely weird, but I was already there, so I figured I might as well enjoy the meal. I brought my midterm because I figured we would discuss this at the cafe, so I pulled it out at the table, and he told me to put it away, as it wasn't necessary to our discussion. He started asking me about my goals for the future and what I wanted to do after graduating, and I told him I wasn't too sure yet, but I was thinking about grad school. He told me that he's been noticing my increased efforts in his class and asked if there was a reason I was so interested in his lessons, to which I replied that I was trying my hardest to just get a good grade and maintain my GPA. He seemed let down by this answer, but then proceeded to ask me if there was reason. I always stared at him as he walked up and down the lecture hall, and I told him that I learned best by paying the closest attention. I realized where he was going with this, and tried to keep my cool and just get through our lunch, as the food had just arrived. I wanted to ask him about his wife and kids but held back because I didn't want him to get the wrong idea, but before I knew it, he was asking me about my relationship status and if I was interested in the guys on campus. He said that in the class he has me in, there is no guy smart enough to be worthy of me and my highly intellectual self. He was straight up flirting and not keeping it low-key whatsoever. After that awkward lunch was over, he offered to drive me home or wherever I was headed to next, and I politely declined but thanked him for lunch. I told him I wanted to head to the cafe next door to study for one of my other classes. The next class I had with him, he made me feel extremely uncomfortable by physically putting his hands on me. I was sitting in my usual seat, which just so happened to be in the front of the lecture hall, and as my professor was pacing across the hall as he usually does while lecturing, he just casually placed his hand on my shoulder and squeezed it while verbally exaggerating something. Then he let it brush lightly against my collarbone as he walked away. At this point, I was livid, because how dare he? I stayed myself after class, and through my anger had the guts to ask him what his intentions were and what he wanted from me, and to that he said, "Oh, by now I think you know exactly what I want from you." I was disgusted, especially because the way he said it felt like a threat. He continued to say that the only way I was promised in 4.0 in his class this semester would be if I gave it up just a little bit. I was so disgusted and walked out of his class and nearly had a panic attack while running to my dorm. The way the world is now, I feel like nobody ever believes women, and his intentions were never laid out in front of me word for word, but the next time I have a conversation with him, I'm going to record the interaction with my phone in my pocket so that I would at least have some evidence for when I bring it up to authorities.